The alarm had been going for 11 seconds when Elias Varen finished his coffee. He set the mug down on the shelf beside his mop cart with the deliberate calm of a man who had heard every alarm the Aurelius Dyson Shell could produce. He had been cleaning its vents for 30 years. He knew which alarm meant a pressure sensor had finally given up its ghost. Those were the ones that shrieked in short, clipped bursts, like a man getting punched. He knew which alarm meant a crew deck fire suppression line had triggered. Those wailed low and long, almost mournful. And he knew, with a certainty that lived somewhere below conscious thought, which alarm meant the secondary cooling loop was in trouble. This one was a low, oscillating tone. Rhythmic. Almost musical if you were the type to find music in catastrophe. He pulled on his work gloves, thick, heat-resistant polymer, the fingers worn smooth at the tips from years of gripping conduit pipes, and reached for his tool satchel. It was not a glamorous bag. It was scuffed grey canvas held together by 2 buckles and a prayer, and it contained, among other things, a roll of high-temp sealing tape, a hand torch, a set of manual pressure gauges, 3 worn rags, and a cluster of heavy-duty structural paper clips that he used to pin his daily maintenance logs to the conduit boards near Section 7. He did not reach for his comms unit to call it in. He already knew what they would say. He already knew what the AI would do. He had seen both perform their anxious dance before, 18 months ago, when Valve Cluster 14 Gamma had started hiccuping during the monsoon season of Platform Deck BS hydroponic cycle. The engineers had spent 4 hours reviewing simulation data while he had spent 4 minutes tightening a corroded bracket with his thumb and a borrowed wrench. He picked up his satchel, stepped over the wet streak his mop had left on the deck plating, and walked toward Maintenance Corridor 7 South at a pace that was neither slow nor hurried. The alarm kept singing its low, cycling note. Beneath his boots, the deck plates vibrated with a frequency that told him the main thermal exchange pumps were working at elevated capacity, compensating for something downstream. He knew that feeling in his feet the way a ship's captain knows swells by the pitch of a hull. He turned into the corridor. In the primary operations hub, a room that looked exactly as expensive as it cost, Chief Engineer Solon Kemderim was already pulling up the diagnostic overlay when the first junior technician ran in from the corridor, still tying her collar. "Aria's running the simulation now," the technician said, breathless. She flagged a thermal lock cascade originating in secondary loop delta, subsection. "I can read," Sola said, not unkindly. She was staring at the holographic board, which displayed the shell's cooling architecture in a web of blue and white lines, a circulatory system for a structure large enough to house 6 million people and the fusion core that kept them all warm and alive. One node near the outer ring of secondary loop delta pulsed red. Steadily. Insistently. Like a fever that would not break. "Aria," she said. "Status on the thermal lock. What are we looking at?" The Ari's voice was measured, pleasant, utterly without fear. "Thermal lock cascade detected in secondary loop delta, valve cluster 9 echo. Current core temperature is at 41% above nominal. Projected trajectory indicates a critical threshold breach in, a pause so brief it was almost human, 19 minutes, 14 seconds. Evacuation of the residential rings proximate to the core ejection corridor is recommended." The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when someone has said a thing that everyone was afraid to hear. "What's causing the lock?" said Deputy Engineer Pharaoh Shin from behind his own console. He was young, competent, brilliant. He had graduated first in his class from the Helix Institute and had never once, in 3 years of service, actually crawled inside a maintenance shaft. "Sensor data is inconclusive," Aria said. "I am running a full fluid dynamic simulation to identify the obstruction point. Estimated completion time, another pause, 16 minutes. "That gives us 3 minutes of margin," Sola said flatly. "Run it faster." "I am running at maximum capacity," Aria said. "The simulation environment requires full fidelity to isolate the variable." Sola looked at the pulsing red node. She looked at the countdown that had appeared, unbidden, in the upper corner of the board, 1902. 1901, 7 p.m. "Get me options," she said. "Manual overrides. Bypass routes. Anything." Pharaoh was already at his console, pulling schematics. "Secondary loop delta bypass is valve cluster 9 echo, lever B. If we can trip it manually, we reroute the coolant flow around whatever's blocking the primary path. But it's deep in shaft 7 south. The heat in there. How hot?" "Shaft ambient is currently 412 degrees Fahrenheit. And rising." The room absorbed this. Nobody moved toward the door. Elias had already been in shaft 7 south for 4 minutes. He had not told anyone. There was no one in this section of the shell to tell. The closest crew station was a quarter-kilometre back toward the residential ring, and the maintenance radio channels were, as usual during an active alert, clogged with the voices of people asking questions nobody could answer yet. The shaft was not designed for human beings. It had been designed for maintenance drones, small, agile machines the size of a dog that could navigate the tight bends and corrugated pipe surfaces with fluid efficiency. The drones were excellent. They were also, at this moment, offline. Their guidance systems had locked up when the thermal cascade triggered an automatic protocol that pulled all drone power to the cooling pumps. Elias had passed 3 of them on his way in, sitting inert in their wall cradles like sleeping animals. He was not a small man. He was 61 years old, lean in the way of men who have spent decades moving through spaces not designed for them, and his shoulders scraped both walls as he crawled. The corrugated surface of the shaft floor bit into his kneecaps through his work trousers. The heat was a physical presence, not warmth, not even heat in the domestic sense, but something more aggressive, something that pressed against the skin and communicated its intentions clearly. The air smelled of ozone and hot metal and something older underneath, a mineral smell, faintly sulphurous, like the inside of a rock that had never been cracked open. He had smelled that particular combination before. Twice. Both times, it had come from the calcification deposits that built up in the secondary valve housings when the coolant mix ran high in manganese during certain orbital seasons. The sensors never caught it because the deposits formed gradually, a micrometer at a time, until one day the valve couldn't quite close all the way, and then one day it couldn't close at all. Aria didn't know about the smell. Aria had sensors everywhere, but she did not have a nose, and she did not have 30 years of crawling through shafts that smelled exactly like this one. Elias kept moving. The shaft bent sharply left at a junction marked with faded yellow paint. He had painted that junction himself, 16 years ago, after a new crew of technicians had gotten turned around during a drill and spent 2 hours going in circles. He pressed himself against the inner curve of the bend, exhaling to make himself narrower, and felt his shoulder joint protest as he pulled through. The deck plates outside the shaft vibrated with a frequency that had changed since he'd entered. Higher now. More urgent. The pumps were working harder, which meant the core temperature was still climbing, which meant whatever was blocking the valve was holding firm. He kept moving. Aria. Sola's voice was even. She had made it even deliberately. Around her, the operations hub had filled, 2 more senior engineers, a systems administrator, 3 technicians, and the Shell's duty commander, a broad-shouldered woman named Harris who stood at the back of the room saying nothing and watching everything. Where are we on the simulation? 13 minutes remaining. I have isolated the obstruction to a 40-centimeter segment of the secondary coolant pathway at valve cluster 9 Echo. However, I am unable to determine the precise nature of the obstruction without further data. My models indicate a probability of 67% that it is a mechanical failure of the valve seating, 21% probability of a coolant crystallization event, 12% probability of... What about a mineral deposit? Pharaoh interrupted. A pause. Mineral calcification is not modeled as a primary failure mode for this valve cluster. Sensors show no indication of... The sensors can't see inside the valve housing at current temperatures, Pharaoh said. He was pulling up a secondary schematic, fingers moving fast. If it's calcification, the bypass lever, lever B, would be frozen in place too. You'd have to physically break the deposit loose to trip it. That is correct. However, a physical intervention at current shaft temperatures is not survivable without. What kind of tools are rated for that temperature? Aria began listing. The list was thorough, precise, and described equipment that lived in the emergency equipment locker 3 levels up, a 7-minute round trip even at a run. Sola looked at the timer. 14:32. The math was not complicated. Get someone moving for that locker, she said. Now. 2 technicians left at a run. She watched them go and said nothing about the 4 minutes they had already spent standing still. The temperature in the shaft was not something Elias experienced as a number. He did not have a readout. He experienced it as a tightness behind his eyes and a dryness in his throat that arrived faster than thirst usually does, and as a sensation in his exposed forearms, where the work gloves ended and his rolled sleeves began, like standing too close to an open furnace door. He had been in hot shafts before. Not this hot, but closer than most people would believe. He did not breathe faster. Fast breathing in extreme heat was how you got yourself into trouble, lungs like bellows, sucking in air that was trying its best to cook you from the inside. He breathed slow, deliberate, through his nose, where the air had at least a few more centimeters of passage to cool before it hit anything important. He could hear valve cluster 9 echo before he saw it. It produced a sound he had learned to recognize 15 years ago on a training walkthrough. A low, strained whine, the sound of a mechanism trying to do its job and finding itself unable. Like a door that has swollen shut and is being leaned on by someone too polite to kick it. He came around the last bend in the shaft and saw the valve housing, a squat, cylindrical unit bolted to the pipe junction, its surface discolored by heat to a mottled brown and blue. The bypass lever, lever B, a manual failsafe that the design engineers had included in the original blueprints 40 years ago with the approximate confidence that no one would ever actually need it, jutted from the housing at a slight upward angle. It should have been pointing down. In the bypass position, it pointed down. Elias reached forward with his right hand, pressing his palm flat against the lever's handle. He pushed. Nothing. Not stuck in the normal way, not the resistance of mechanical friction or a jam spring. This was the stillness of something encased. He felt the lever's handle with his fingertips, running them along the junction between the lever arm and the housing, and found what he had expected to find, the slight roughness, the sandy granular texture of mineral calcification. The deposit had crept into the joint and hardened. The lever was sealed in place as effectively as if someone had welded it. He reached into his satchel. It was not a complicated tool. It was not a precision instrument. It had not been designed, in any sense of the word, for this situation. It was a heavy-duty structural paperclip, the kind used throughout the Shell's manual logging system to pin sheaves of maintenance records to the wire conduit boards near each section's administrative station. They were made of high-tensile steel wire, bent into an elongated loop, and they were designed to do one thing: hold paper. They were approximately 12 centimeters long and 3 millimeters in diameter. Elias had 6 of them in his satchel because he had pinned his logs that morning and put the extras in his pocket out of habit, the same way he had been doing since his second year on the job, when a supervisor had told him that a man who didn't have his paperclips on him was a man who hadn't finished his paperwork. He took one clip and bent the inner loop open with both thumbs, flattening it into a roughly L-shaped probe. His gloves made this awkward. He pulled the right glove off with his teeth, tucked it under his arm, and worked the metal with his bare right hand. The metal was warm, everything in here was warm, but manageable. The clip steel was stiff, hard to bend, and that was exactly what he needed. It was not going to flex under load. It was going to hold its shape and transmit force. He maneuvered himself forward until he was directly over the valve housing, his weight on his elbows and his left knee, his right hand extended toward the junction between the lever arm and the housing. The ozone smell was stronger here, sharp, almost metallic, like the air after lightning strike. The vibration coming through the shaft walls was higher now, a trembling that he could feel in his back teeth. He had perhaps 8 minutes. Maybe less. He could not be certain and could not afford to think about it. He inserted the flat, bent end of the paperclip into the joint. The first thing he felt was resistance. The deposit was not soft. It had the consistency of old plaster, brittle on the surface, harder underneath, and stubborn in the way of things that have had months to settle into themselves. He worked the clip's tip back and forth in a small arc, feeling for the interface between the calcification and the lever arm's metal. The clip made a faint scratching sound that was inaudible beneath the whine of the valve and the ambient roar of the cooling system. He watched the tip of the clip, not his hand. Watching his hand would tell him about his own muscles. Watching the tip would tell him about the material he was working against. A small fragment of the deposit broke off and fell into the housing. He didn't see it. He felt the infinitesimal shift in resistance. He moved the clip slightly and found a new purchase angle. Worked it. Felt another fragment loosen. The lever did not move yet. He had not expected it to. He kept working. "Aria, I need options other than the emergency locker," Sola said. Her voice was still level. It was costing her more now. "Is there any manual tool rated for 400-degree ambient currently inside Shaft 7 South?" "Negative," Aria said immediately. "Registered tool inventory shows no high-temperature-rated implements within Shaft 7 South. The section's maintenance cart, assigned to worker ID 7714, is parked at the shaft entrance, but its contents do not include." "Worker 7714, Pharaoh said. He was pulling up the personnel screen. "That's," he paused for half a second, "Elias Varen. Maintenance. Section 7. He's been on shift since 0600. "Where is he now?" Sola asked. "His locator badge." Pharaoh trailed off. He turned from his screen, and there was something in his expression that Sola could not immediately categorize. Not alarm. Not quite surprise. Something closer to the expression a person makes when they have finally understood a sentence they have been reading too quickly. His locator badge is transmitting from inside shaft 7 south. He's at the 9 Echo junction. A beat of silence. He went in without authorization, said the duty commander from the back of the room. Her voice was flat and not unkind. He went in without a temperature suit, Pharaoh said. Solar stared at the locator dot on her overlay. It was not moving. It had not moved in 3 minutes. It was sitting directly on top of the 9 Echo valve housing icon like a period at the end of a sentence. Can we reach him on comms? Pharaoh tried. Maintenance Channel 7. Varen, this is the operations hub. Acknowledge. No response. In the shaft, the ambient electromagnetic noise from the thermal cascade was sufficient to turn the maintenance radios into expensive jewelry. Send someone in after him, Commander Harris said. The shaft ambient, Pharaoh began. Send someone in after him, she said again, in the same tone. Pharaoh started moving. On the board, the timer read, 7:41. Elias had broken through the outer layer of the deposit in the 4th minute. The inner layer was harder. It was always harder. The outer crust formed first and was porous. It absorbed heat and vibration differently, expanded and contracted with the thermal cycles, and eventually became friable. The inner layer was denser, more crystalline, formed under pressure from the first layer's weight above it. It was the inner layer that had seized the lever arm. His right hand was shaking. Not from fear, from heat and exertion, the fine muscles of his fingers performing the kind of sustained precision work they were not young enough to find easy. He was sweating heavily, and the sweat evaporated almost immediately in the shaft's dry heat, which meant he felt drier than he was and drank less than he should have, which he understood intellectually and could not entirely correct for. The paperclip's bent tip was now seated in the gap he had worked open between the lever arm and the calcification collar. He had a leverage point. He needed force, controlled, directional force, applied in a single smooth motion, enough to shear the remaining deposit from the lever housing without snapping the clip or bouncing the tip out of position. He braced his left elbow against the shaft wall. He pressed his left knee into the corrugated floor and felt the ridges bite. He brought his right hand into position with the careful deliberateness of someone threading a needle in a moving vehicle, everything else still, only the hand moving, only the wrist. He breathed out. He pushed. The deposit resisted for 3/4 of a second, which is a very long time when your entire weight is behind a bent paperclip. Then it cracked. A sound like a tooth breaking, swallowed immediately by the mechanical roar around it. A granular spray of calcification dust hit the back of Elias's hand, hot, scratchy, almost painless in comparison to everything else, and the lever arm dropped free, swinging downward through its full arc with a suddenness that sent the clip skittering off the housing and into the darkness of the shaft behind him. And the lever went click. A small sound. A quiet sound. The sound of a piece of metal moving 3 centimeters that it had not been able to move before. In the pipe behind the housing, Elias heard the coolant flow change. It was not dramatic, not a rush, not a surge, but a settling, a shift in frequency, the way a river sounds when a logjam gives. The whining strain of the valve ceased. The vibration in the shaft walls began, slowly, to diminish. He lay on the corrugated floor with his eyes closed and his right hand pressed flat against the cooler metal of the lever housing, and he listened to the machine breathe again. It was, in his professional opinion, a very satisfying sound. In the operations hub, the red node went green. It did not fade or transition. It went from red to green in a single display cycle, one moment a crisis, the next a resolved condition, in the manner of digital systems that do not experience the subjective time between cause and effect. ARIA registered the bypass completion and the restoration of coolant flow to secondary loop delta at 7:02 on the countdown clock, with a margin of 4 seconds before her own simulation had finished processing. The room exhaled. Solar stood very still for a moment, watching the temperature readings begin their slow return to nominal. Then she pulled up the event log and read it carefully, looking for the action that had triggered the resolution. There was no logged manual command. There was no drone activity. There was no remote actuator signal. The event log showed, valve cluster 9 echo bypass lever B status change, locked to open. Source, mechanical. Cause, undetermined. ARIA, she said slowly. What caused the lever to trip? Unknown, ARIA said. Physical sensor data shows no registered intervention. Given the thermal stress on the valve housing and the documented brittleness of mineral calcification deposits under high-temperature oscillation, the most probable explanation is spontaneous mechanical failure of the deposit under thermal load, resulting in lever release. Probability of this mechanism, 71%. I am classifying this event as a statistical anomaly within expected parameters. Pharaoh had stopped halfway to the shaft entrance when his comms lit up with the resolution alert. He stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at his screen, then turned and walked slowly back to the hub. He did not say anything about the locator dot, which had, in the last 2 minutes, moved from the 9 Echo junction back toward the shaft entrance at a steady, unhurried pace. He noted it. He filed it somewhere in his memory where he was not entirely sure what to do with it. He sat down at his console and began writing the incident report. He wrote, Valve Cluster 9 Echo bypass achieved via spontaneous deposit failure under thermal stress. No personnel intervention required. ARIA classification, statistical anomaly. Recommend scheduled maintenance inspection of secondary loop calcification levels. He paused for a moment over the recommendation line. Then he added, in the field for additional notes, maintenance log review for Section 7 should include worker ID 7714 shift records. Informal consultation re. Secondary valve behavior in high manganese coolant cycles may be of operational value. He submitted the report. He did not send it to anyone in particular. Elias Varen came out of Shaft 7 South at 11:43 in the morning. He was sweating through his work shirt, which was dark enough that it didn't show badly. His right hand had a faint pink flush across the knuckles and the back of 2 fingers from where the deposit dust had hit, a mild superficial thing, nothing that needed attention, the kind of thing that would feel mildly warm for 2 days and then simply stop. He rolled his sleeve back down over it and buttoned the cuff. The alarm had stopped. The corridor was quiet except for the ambient hum of a functional cooling system doing its job without complaint. He retrieved his mop cart from the shaft entrance, checked that his satchel was still buckled. It was, and noted, with mild irritation, that he had lost one of his paperclips somewhere in the shaft. He took the remaining 5 and put them in his left breast pocket, where he could reach them without opening the satchel. He consulted his work schedule on the small laminated card he kept clipped to the cart's handle. Section 7, Corridor F, Vent Filters. Then the crew deck washrooms, which were always bad on a Tuesday. Then a walk of the lower observation ring, which was mostly just walking and looking and listening, which was, in Elias's considered opinion, the most useful thing a maintenance worker could do on any given day. He started mopping. The deck plates were cool beneath his boots. The cooling system's steady vibration was back to its normal pitch, low, even, the deep bass note of a machine operating within its design envelope. He had not had to think about that vibration consciously for 30 years. He had also not had to not think about it, which is a different thing. It was simply there, a piece of sensory information that his body processed alongside the smell of the cleaning solution and the resistance of the mop head against the deck and the faint pull in his lower back that was just the shape of a Tuesday. He had saved 6 million people. He had done it with a piece of bent wire. He did not think about either of these things as he mopped. This was not because he was simple or incurious or blind to the significance of what had happened. It was because the significance of it lived somewhere that did not require his conscious attention, in the same place that knew which alarm was screaming before he finished his coffee, in the same place that had known, without being told, that the smell in the shaft meant calcification and not crystallization and not a jammed spring. The knowledge was there. It had always been there. It was just not the kind of knowledge that announced itself. His comms unit buzzed. A maintenance ticket, auto-generated by the system, Section 7, Shaft 7 South, post-incident inspection required. Schedule at earliest convenience. He accepted the ticket and scheduled it for Thursday. The mop moved. The deck got clean. The shell hummed around him like a living thing. 3 weeks after the incident, a junior engineer named Priya Holst was assigned to review the Section 7 maintenance logs as part of the post-incident audit. She was 26 years old and had excellent attention to detail, which was why she noticed something that the automated review had not flagged. Worker 7714's log for the day of the thermal cascade incident contained the standard entries: vent filter check, Section 7F, mop deck, corridors E through G, observation ring walk, lower level. All entries were time-stamped, all signed, all filed correctly against the maintenance schedule. There was also an entry at 11:47 a.m., 4 minutes after the timestamp showed Elias Varen had returned to active corridor duty, that read, in the flat economy of word style of a man who had been writing maintenance logs for 3 decades, Shaft 7 South, Secondary Loop Junction 9E Visual Inspection. Found and cleared mineral deposit on bypass lever housing. Recommend coolant mix calcium-magnesium balance review before next orbital cycle. Replaced 1 structural paperclip, maintenance supply stock. Priya read this 3 times. Then she read the incident report. Then she read Aria's event log. Then she sat in her small office with the ventilation humming and the pale light of the console washing over her face, and she thought, for quite a long time, about the distance between what the sensors know and what a person knows. She wrote a note to Pharaoh Shin. "Have you read Varen's log?" He responded in 12 seconds. "Yes." "Don't change the incident report." She stared at this for a moment. Then she wrote, "Why not?" His answer took longer. 40 seconds. Long enough that she knew he had thought about it before writing, because if we change the report, it becomes a story about a statistical anomaly that was actually a janitor. And then people spend their energy on whether he was authorized to be in the shaft, and whether he should have called it in first, and whether there's a liability question around the temperature exposure. And none of that is the actual lesson. She read this twice. Then, "What's the actual lesson?" He answered, "Schedule the calcium-magnesium coolant review. And add a budget line for quarterly secondary valve housing inspections. Manual, not sensor-based. The sensors can't smell." She approved both items by end of day. In Section 7, Corridor F, Elias Varen was cleaning a vent filter. The filter was clogged with the fine, particulate residue of 6 million people living their lives in a structure large enough to hold them all, cooking smells and workshop dust and the exhaled carbon of 100,000 sleeping bodies and the dry mineral tang of systems that were, for now, working exactly as intended. He pulled the filter free, shook it out, replaced it. It took 40 seconds. The shell hummed. Nobody noticed. That was, Elias thought, entirely the point.